Tales of the Forbidden City in China have begun to resurface, and new intriguing facts are shocking to observers. It's so contrasting to the 21st century freedom we enjoy. Picture this: you're walking down a cobblestone street on a random beautiful afternoon. Out of nowhere, you're blindfolded, feet bound, taken away, and isolated from the rest of the world for years and years. Sounds like a familiar crime in the modern day, wouldn't you say? Girls and young women were taken from their homes, irrespective of social status or family background. These females were stripped of their human rights and kept for one sinister purpose, and they became lifelong concubines to powerful Chinese emperors. The harsh reality of Chinese women in the Ming Dynasty. In the era of the Ming Dynasty, which lasted for nearly 300 years, from 1368 to 1644, the former Chinese imperial palace was built. It was the winter residence of the Emperor of China from the Ming Dynasty and was called the Forbidden City. The most bizarre things happened there. All females in the Forbidden City were carefully isolated in the imperial quarters deep inside the palace. Women in the Forbidden City were not allowed to leave the northern section and were confined to the inner court. The sole purpose of the selected concubines was to serve as sex slaves and to rear children. How harsh! This nasty culture was a usual practice in court from as early as 265 AD. These women held the title Xiaonu, and the selection criteria ranged from whoever was emperor at that moment. In the Ming Dynasty, no household was allowed to be absent from the selection. All women from each house would allow themselves to be put under these conditions. The weird selection. The selection process was always tight, and it was considered an honor every family wanted. It was a serious competition, and detailed criteria were considered. A list of all available females would be sent to a board known as the Board of Revenue, and these girls were brought to the Shenwu Gate of the Forbidden City at a chosen date. Every young and unmarried woman went through the selection process. Only married girls and those who were certified with physical disabilities or deformities were spared. The Shenwu Gate roughly translates to marital spirit in Mandarin, and they would be accompanied by their parents or nearest relatives alongside their clan heads. During the first round of the competition, lines of 100 women each were made according to age. About 1,000 were eliminated based on physical features. Women were not selected for being too tall, too short, fat, thin, and in those days in China, physical attractiveness was more of a misfortune than a benefit. On the second day, the eunuchs, powerful men in court, examined the women's bodies extensively and by all means necessary. These men went on to evaluate the girls' voices and general mannerisms. This process further reduced their numbers by another 2,000. The third day would be for inspecting their feet, hands, and grace of movement, after which another 1,000 would be eliminated. The remaining 1,000 women were made to do various gynecological examinations, doing away with another 700, and about 300 women would then remain, which started yet another round of bizarre procedures. It turns out that the emperors only wanted the best. The sad life of a Chinese concubine, sexual slavery, and child rearing. The rest of these 300 women would then be housed within the palace, where they underwent rigorous testing for intelligence, merits, moral character, and temperament. This would last for approximately a month, and most of them worked as maids and servants to the palace, serving the Queen Mother and royal family. The top 50 candidates were then subject to further examination and interviews about educational topics. Math, literature, and art questions were all asked, and the women ranked accordingly. It is pretty ironic that the concubines had to be intelligent as well. At the end of this rigorous process, the top 3 favorites were then selected and named imperial concubines. During that era, only a few individuals who successfully passed the procedure would be recognized by the emperor and gain his favor. The majority of these women would live in desolate isolation, remain lonely, and as a result, there was a high level of political intrigue and envy among the concubines. Concubine criteria and role description. The cruelty of the Ming emperors was boundless, and this evil was explicitly targeted toward the imperial concubines. Some Ming emperors were known to have upwards of 9,000 concubines, many of whom had been kidnapped from their homes and were forbidden to leave their prisons, which was a quite evil practice indeed. The women took on various roles, with all of the old concubines already present and the new ones now obtained. Some women were concubines whose primary role was to have children for the emperor. The ones who were lucky enough to have male children were then promoted to become imperial consorts. The patriarchy was really at its peak, and they were ranked, with the empress, the queen, being the most highly regarded. Insane routines around concubine culture. The founder of the Ming dynasty was the Hongwu emperor. He would establish his dynasty and then adopt the name Ming. This oddly translates to brilliant in Mandarin. He was also known to be a very ruthless man, and behind closed doors, he kept concubines confined and subjected them to torture. His pride and jealousy drove him to control every aspect of their lives. To continue to control them even after his death, he started the tradition whereby concubines would be killed, forced to commit suicide, or buried alive alongside the dead emperor. All of the concubines were strictly forbidden from having sex with any person other than the present emperor. Every woman's activities were overseen and monitored by the eunuchs, the same men who had examined them in the past via various methods. Before the emperor visited each woman's bedchamber, she was required to bathe and be examined by a doctor from the court. The emperor would then pick favorites. He cannot possibly be with all of his numerous concubines throughout his lifetime, and many of them would spend their entire lives in the palace without ever having contact with the emperor. This bred contempt and jealousy amongst them, with hundreds and sometimes thousands of concubines at the emperor's disposal. Any lady the emperor graced with a visit would be subject to jealous rivalries. The peak and fall of the Ming dynasty, a story of tyranny, mass executions, and death by starvation. Emperor Yongle, a known terror and the third ruler of the Ming dynasty, has one of the most horrible histories with concubines. He's known to have rounded up 2,800 women from this harem and then sentenced them to a gory execution by slicing. In this mass execution, even girls as young as 12 years old would be put to death, which is undoubtedly beyond sad. The emperor got away with these gruesome murders, as there was no mention of this massacre in the official record. Lady Sui, a concubine of the court who had been away from the palace then, put a written account of this event in the books. Shortly afterwards, she and 15 of the emperor's remaining concubines were disastrously hung from white silk nooses in the halls of the Forbidden City on the day of Yongle's funeral, a final farewell bloodbath to his regime. The 10th Ming ruler, Zhengdi, from 1505, collected so many concubines that many starved to death since there was not enough shelter and food to supply them. Historians far and wide attest that his rule would lead to the downfall of the Ming dynasty, and it's not a far-fetched idea. His direct successor, Jai Jing, was obsessed with finding an elixir to provide him with eternal life. He believed this elixir's key ingredient was virgin's menstrual blood. During his reign, he ordered thousands of girls to be rounded up and taken to the Forbidden City to be harvested. All they ate were mulberries and dew to purify their bodies. And, as you would imagine, many of them died of starvation and malnourishment. In 1542, 16 concubines would fight back. This attempt to bring down the violent emperor became known as the Renyan plot. They were caught and executed by slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. Sadly, the families of these women were then also executed. You might be surprised by these actions, but this is just a fraction of insane stories from old cultures. Tap here on your screen to hear even wilder truths about the harsh life of concubines of ancient Asia. And also, be sure to leave a comment down below.